Welcome, everybody. We'll get started in a minute. We'll give people time to arrive, and then we'll get going. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. The SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice of the University of San Francisco acknowledges our presence on the unceded land of the indigenous Ohlone communities and pays our respects to these traditional caretakers and elders, past, present, and emerging. It is our intention that this acknowledgement plays a role, however infinitesimal, in a much larger process of confronting the past in order to create a not yet realized future rooted in justice. Today, we're proud to be hosting a book launch for Penina Eilberg-Schwartz and Sulaiman Khatib for their newly released book, In This Place Together, A Palestinian's Journey to Collective Liberation. I'll introduce them and the book more in a moment. I want to say that after their presentation, we will have the opportunity to ask questions. You can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time during the event, and we will try to make sure we get to your questions. I'll also post a link to their book in the chat in just a moment. My name is Oren Kroll-Zeldin, and I am the interim director of the SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice. I want to begin by thanking the SWIG JSSJ faculty and staff for their help in putting this event together. I also want to express my deep gratitude to our co-sponsors for the event. Many thanks to the Middle East Studies program at USF, and also to the USF Institute for Nonviolence and Social Justice for your help in making this event possible. I also want to thank Extend, an organization that introduces emerging leaders to human rights, civil society, and political leaders in Israel and Palestine. I know that Sulaiman and Penina are longtime partners of Extend, and we are grateful for Extend's work and their co-sponsorship of today's event. I'd also like to take a brief moment to tell you about the SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice. Founded in 1977, our program is the first Jewish Studies chair or program at a Catholic university anywhere in the world. In 2008, we were reestablished as the SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, the first academic program worldwide to formally link Jewish studies with social justice. Including a minor in this field, in the classroom, the program offers a wide range of significant Jewish studies courses not found in other educational settings. And beyond the classroom, we offer extraordinary events that are free and open to the public, such as what's going on here and now today. Though the SWIG JSSJ program, or rather through the SWIG JSSJ program, we believe that education is the best long-term way to create systemic change. Whether one has the time to take a semester-long course or a mere hour to hear from speakers, education is fundamental to making our world better, paramount in shining the spotlight on the margins, on oppressed communities who are mistreated merely because of their race, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual orientation, or another social identity altogether. Now I would like to formally introduce today's speakers. Sulaiman Khatib was born in Hizmeh, Jerusalem, and currently lives in Ramallah. He's an active member of various programs aiming to promote a peaceful solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. He is co-founder of Combatants for Peace, a joint nonviolent Israeli-Palestinian movement to end the occupation. And I must say, for the sake of my students, he was featured in the documentary Disturbing the Peace, which many of them have watched. Sulaiman has been nominated twice for the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of the movement. Penina Eilberg-Schwartz is an American Jewish activist who lives and writes in the San Francisco Bay Area. She has worked on issues of justice in Israel-Palestine with several organizations and for a long time. I first met Penina, I think it was probably 13 years ago, which is sort of hard to believe, in the context of one such organization. And I've been proud to call Penina a friend and colleague ever since. Penina is a member of If Not Now, a movement working to end American Jewish support for the occupation. She co-wrote the chapbook Everything in the Speaking of It, and is currently working on a novel as well as a book-length essay about the myth of the Jewish nose. As a Palestinian youth, Sulaiman Khatib encountered the occupation in his village and attempted to fight back, stabbing an Israeli. Imprisoned at the age of 14, he began a process of political and spiritual transformation that is still unfolding today. He asked Penina Eilberg-Schwartz, an American Jew, to write this book. Based on years of conversation between them, in the book, Khatib shares how his activism became deeply rooted in the belief that we must ground all work, from dialogue to direct action to healing, in recognition of the history and humanity of the other. He reveals how he became convinced that Palestinian freedom can flourish alongside Jewish connection to the land where he was born. Still, as he built friendships with Israelis and resisted the occupation alongside them, he could not lose sight of the great power imbalance in the relationship, of all the violence and erasure still present as they dreamt forward together. In this place together opens up to the dangers and hopes of working with others across vast differences in power and experience. And now it is with great pleasure and excitement that I introduce Sulaiman Khatib and Penina Eilberg-Schwartz. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having us, Oren. I'm going to let Suli talk first, but just wanted to say thank you for the lovely intro.
Thanks, Oren. And really, it's our honor to be invited by San Francisco University, and also a great thank to our close friend, Sam from Extend. I've been watching him leading the organization since the beginning. So I would share with you my background like shortly, because you can read the details in the book. Just want to say, I'm really moved, Oren, when you spoke about the recognition to the indigenous people where San Francisco University is sitting. And I hope in our part of the world that we can really learn from this experience to acknowledge the people that lived here before. So this is really moving me. I have to say I'm like involved with this. So shortly, like as you mentioned, Oren, about my background, I just want to say it in 3 parts shortly. One before jail time, because as you said, I born in a village northeast of Jerusalem called Hizmeh. My community and my village has been living there since generations. My family actually has been recorded in the Ottomanic records in the 15th century. So talking about indigenous culture, that's where I'm coming from. My family coming from indigenous culture and tradition that really observe like a long history of folklore and tradition that include many things that explained very well in the book, from like the dress, the tattoos, to the music. I play the flute myself because we learn how to do this from a childhood time. And also, I learn also in my childhood to be connected to the land, where my family and ancestors used to say that we belong to the land. Since this book and this conflict and all the conversation about resources and land and power, it's really important to mention that I'm coming from a culture that looked at the land as part of us, and we are part of the land. And maybe this is a new heavy culture, but that's my mom generation culture actually. So I grew up like to be very friendly and close to the land, to the trees, to the olive trees, to the za'atar and jasmine, and to the tradition of the seasons, for example. And you can read this in the book, like how we know when it's gonna rain. We just look west to the Mediterranean Sea, and we can tell when it's gonna rain. And many other like small details of the tradition here. I grew up in Jerusalem, and around Jerusalem, next to my village, there's a Jewish neighborhood called Neve Yaakov, established in 1924, I believe. And usually, like sometimes, you know, as we speak about this conflict, people think it's war all the time. It is ongoing occupation, but obviously some moments has been here of interaction. So I used to play soccer, football, with kids from Neve Yaakov actually. So I knew some Hebrew from home a little bit because my father used to work in Jerusalem municipality. And from my younger age, from my childhood, I joined the Palestinian resistance. And really, I believe, like some people maybe in the audience, for them, it's maybe first time to hear a Palestinian narrative. And we are talking a lot in the book and in the movie that you mentioned, Disturbing the Peace, about multiple narratives and the narratives where we coming from. So the narrative I'm coming from is basically I have to be like a hero to protect our homeland. Physically, I'm not talking about like theories. It's like a physical threat to our space where I used to play, where my family used to grow. A lot of agriculture, for example, has been like threatened by settlers movement and building settlements that cross, that basically cut the historical road and culture between my village and our main city, Jerusalem. Um, so as you know, maybe people ask like, how would you revolt or not, or live with the system? So many people like out of survival need, maybe just go ahead with the system. For myself, in my school was also forbidden to talk about Palestine or politics, or to use the word Palestine, or to have a Palestinian flag, for example. So I started when I was like 12, 13 years old. And the time was my brother was in jail, my older brother, and I became part of the uh, like activist network, let's call it this way, in order to, you know, raise Palestinian flag, raise revolutionary spirit for people to revolt against the military occupation. Means this basically that you can't continue your normal life in the school. Uh, because the school was under total Israeli control actually. So I had created my own group of kids like 14 years old from my generation to fight the occupation with. At the time, like let's speak honesty, when I was 14, I was drawn to militarization. I was drawn to like armed struggle, you know, Che Guevara, long hair, and you know, like rebel against the system. But the only way I knew was armed struggle, and I didn't have access to arm. So I did whatever I could at the time, from throwing stones to preparing cocktail Molotov cocktail, I believe in English. And I end up with other friend from my village. He was 17, I was 14 and 5 months. In order to have weapons, we attacked two Israelis. We stabbed two Israelis. Uh, yeah, it's not always easy to speak about this, but so this operation ended up with a slightly wounded for the two Israelis, and it was a big story in our area, and the media and the army came and searched everybody in the village and did the curfew, and we sneaked to other two villages. Long story. In the end, also, my friend had his family house was demolished by the army, just to mention, because he was apolitical and his family, they were not activists. But as the policy of house demolition, which is still exists, unfortunately, until now, they destroy their house because they said it's illegal. They don't have the right permits, which is impossible to get. So yeah, after a few days, like the army succeed to like find all my group, arrested us. My friend had a golden teeth and he had to take it out, and the Israelis throw us in the TV, and our families were searching for us. We were young. I was 14 and 5 months at this moment. So I ended up in jail. At the time, I was the youngest prisoner for some time among a few thousands of political prisoners. So during the jail time, like I was going back and forth to the court, I became 15, so I was sentenced to 15 years in jail. Maybe important context here note, when we were arrested, we go to Israeli military court, not a normal Israeli civil law. It's a different thing. So yeah, I was sentenced 15 and my friend became 18. He was sentenced 18. That's why many of the prisoners knows us actually because of this story. And so during the jail time, like there are different stages in jail. I spent 10 years and 5 months in jail, basically. And during the jail time, my family was banished by blocking my room in my family's house on the second floor. The army blocked it with iron and cement for the next 10 years as a punishment for the family. Usually they destroy the houses, but I was young. And of course, like the times in jail to start with torture, like physical and psychological torture in the investigation time. This is nothing to do with international law or human rights law. That's really important to mention here. And I continue my struggle and my participation in the activism in jail with other prisoners. Specifically in jail, we adopt food hunger strike as one of the main strategies we use to improve the daily life in jail, the conditions, because basically many people talk about jails and how's the life inside jails. So the Israel never like signed the Geneva Accord for prisoners' rights. So we have to do a lot of action, mainly hunger strike, food hunger strikes, to achieve demands of daily life, like to get more hot water or like clean water or books, unfiltered books, and so on. Like usually we had 30 demands, and once they agree on 25 demands, we stop the hunger strike because our goal is not to die. So just to mention, the hunger strike strategy is really important in our culture, in our history, in my personal story, and thousands of personal stories of Palestinians that were in jail. And I believe this strategy was taken from the IRA guys in Ireland back in the days. So just to give credits back, because usually we like to take the credit for everything, that we are the first one. But the Palestinian prisoners had really succeeded to establish kind of a revolutionary university. That's what we call it in jail. The hunger strike united the prisoners in solidarity with each other because we belong to different groups, different organizations. I was part of Fatah movement, the BLO led by Arafat. And we had like almost 13 organizations. So we had committees like cultural committees, educational committees, struggle committees in order to coordinate the struggle within jail and to coordinate the relations among the prisoners. So I was very active in the first hunger strike. For me, I was 15 for like 16 days with 120 kids in Hebron, in jail in Khalil. Usually we call it mayo milh because we don't eat, we just drink a lot of water and salt. That's why it's called mayo milh. One of the names of the book was like suggested to have salt and water. Actually, it's important in our culture. During the jail time, I studied also a lot. I worked in the library, studied also about Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement in America, and Nelson Mandela and the apartheid system and the struggle against apartheid in South Africa and other non-violence theories in the world. And also from the practice of hunger strikes, I also reached the conclusion that there is no military solution for our conflict. And this is takes long time for many people to reach. But I'm coming from like a personal experience among many other experiences in jail that all explained in the book. So to jump after jail time, as an active person, I started in the second Intifada, my more like a non-violence activism, let's call it, with Palestinians. And that led me also to open up to meet with Israelis that reached the same conclusion, mainly refusers that were in the army and reached the point that there is no military solution and they don't want to continue in this circle of violence. And that's how we established Combatants for Peace 2005-6. We started the secret meetings in Beit Lahem, Beit Jala, through friends with ex-Israeli officers and ex-Palestinian prisoners, and that those meetings led us to establish Combatants for Peace at the time, based on nonviolence and ending the occupation and creating a new narrative, a new community that include people from both sides. More details really also in the movie about that first meeting, which is where we had like a bunch of meetings actually. You know, like when we come together is like meeting your enemies, specifically people with a military background. So to create trust, like it takes a long, long time. So through the years, I believe Combatants for Peace and other groups that I personally connect with them also, and think we have to work as coalition in different organizations in order to make this change happen and to create this community. I just want to highlight maybe quickly that last week we hold the ceremony for Joint Memorial Day. In the first years, we had 70 other people attending, or then we have 500 people attending that ceremony, which is challenging for many people to commemorate the victims from both sides, because the dehumanization here is so deep and based on separation and based also on power dynamic and the good and the bad and us or them. So to create a new culture, a new community that really respect the narratives of both sides, the history, the culture, the Nakba, the Palestinian catastrophe, the indigenous culture that exists here for thousands of years, the belonging to the land and all of that, that takes a lot of courage and a lot of spiritual work to believe and to have a space that multiple narrative can really coexist next to each other, not in control of one or the other. Because, and I finish here, like if we recognize that people from both sides here, both Palestinian and Israelis, have the right to live in freedom and dignity and liberation and safety, and that we're born as equal, I think the practical solutions would be much simple and much easier, because we have a lot in common between us. And as they say, like there is a lot of challenges that we can talk about it later, and we talk a lot about it in the book. I wanted to share this story and stories of many Palestinians and Israelis that I met in the way that affected myself or I affected them, to show a different story on Palestinians and Israeli than the typical mainstream media showing, and to try to participate and support creating this a new narrative, a new story that really give us hope despite all the challenges. And I believe this book will, I hope, will soften hearts of many people. And for me, Penina, as a friend, and also I like her writing style, and I needed someone that I really trust, like blindly, to share all of this with her, like to speak about torture and violence and traumas. So that was the natural like choice for me to try to convince Penina, and I did work on her to convince her for a long time, because she said no a few times on Facebook, and then I met her not far from San Francisco University, actually, convinced her to write the story. And I've been told by many people to share the story, because we do a lot of like talks and lectures. So I'm happy to share this with them whoever like open to read, like, and also to be challenged and not to be in the comfortable zone all the time. And I hope this book will really help our cause basically, and not to focus on creating heroes. That's so what I went through, like it's possible to anybody else to go through and to open up. It's not specific DNA that some people has. Obviously, we need a few people that carry the vision of hope and peace among our peoples, like as a natural thing to happen. Thank you. So I turn the mic to Penina, please.
Thank you so much, Suli. And yeah, just to add I think another piece to our prayer or hope for the book is just, yeah, to soften hearts in the service of moving people towards action, which we can talk more about. But I will back up a little bit and share a little bit about myself and the context to how I arrived to work on this project with Suli. And today I thought I would start in a slightly different place than I usually start, because it's fun to start from different origin points from time to time. So I've been thinking lately about how when Suli was starting to get active and become, aware of the political reality around him and how it was affecting his family and many other Palestinians, or all other Palestinians, my parents were meeting around the same time in a library during rabbinical school in Jerusalem. And I asked them about that time, and they're both very social justice oriented now and very aware of the occupation system and against it and in service of justice work. But I asked them about what their perception of this situation was then when they were in Jerusalem. And my mom said that she doesn't remember hearing the word occupation. This was in the early 80s. And, my dad had a vague memory of a bomb going off at a wedding, and that was kind of his memory of the fact that there was something going on. And when I thought about that and sort of the reality that Suli was facing at that time with his family's land, just the actual sensation of your land being taken away as a new settlement is growing around you, and the distinction between that reality and what my parents were aware of, it felt really important. I think that the American Jewish community has learned a lot and grown a lot, particularly I think over the last 10 years. And I think in many ways we're still in that situation of not being aware of really what it means for Palestinians to live under the system of control. And of course, I will never understand, and nor will anybody understand who doesn't live in that situation. But the more that we move towards that understanding, I think the more tools we have to support Palestinian freedom and our collective liberation. So just a bit more about me. I worked with Abraham's Vision, which is the organization that I met Oren through, and the Center for Transformative Education, both co-founded by Aaron Hahn Tapper of USF fame. And met Suli through my mom. And I think the story is in the book, but we got into a political disagreement right away, which I think defines our conversations over the years. I think the disagreements between us are generally sort of at the deepest place. I think we're very much in agreement and sometimes have differences around emphasis and language and style. But yeah, like Suli said, I said no many times when he asked me to work on the project, because I didn't quite see what my position would be in relation to his story in this project, and happy to talk more about why later. But when I said yes, it was because both I had witnessed, in relationship to my mother and other particularly American Jews who I'd seen Suli speak to, that he had a way of communicating his story that was able to sort of slip through the cracks of the barriers that particularly American Jews and I'd say many Americans and Westerners and many particularly white Americans and Westerners have when listening to Palestinian stories. And I was interested in helping amplify that effect. And I was also interested, and this is sort of the entry point that allowed me to see why I would be involved, is that I had an idea that maybe, and after talking to Suli about it, that we could use the structure of the book and the content, but the structure as well, to explore what joint work means. What does it mean to work with others across difference, and particularly coming from really different relationships to the systems of power that are outside. So, what does it mean for me as a white American Jew with the considerable power that those two identities come with in relation to this particular conflict, and some others, and what does it mean for me to work with Suli to tell his story? So those are things that we were reckoning with throughout the entire book. So I wanted to share a couple of things that I learned, because when we were talking to Oren about this, I know we were talking about just the importance about personal transformation, and I think I can share a couple things that I learned or hope that people take away, and also things that I'm continuing to learn. I definitely am not an expert in any of these things, and I think that was one thing that I hoped to do through the book, was to inspire exploration rather than feeling that we are experts about these things, particularly those of us acting from identities of power. So yeah, I mean, the first thing was just that for people who didn't know, that it's just important to make clear that I think, as Suli said, Palestinians are fighting for survival, for land and life and resources. And Israelis, particularly Ashkenazi Israelis, there can be quite a difference between Ashkenazi and Mizrahi Jewish experience, but Israelis, and certainly Ashkenazi Israelis, are fighting for a feeling, for what Suli said the other day, fighting for feelings, which could sound belittling, but I don't think it is, because we can talk about why feelings are actually legitimate and important. But that difference is really, really important to recognize. And for those of us who already know that, as I'm sure many of us here do, I think the goal is to continue finding ways to feel it and to learn more, and to allow that knowledge to change us in service of finding new ways to move into action, and to move in alignment with our partners who are working towards justice. I think, in relation to that question of, what does it mean for Israelis to be fighting for feelings, for a sense of legitimacy? I think I learned a lot about that through the process. Suli was often challenging me to see more of the Israeli narrative than I was willing to see. And I think that particularly came up for me around the question of Jewish connection to the land, which Suli was talking about a lot when I was in Palestine and Israel. And at first it was really, really difficult for me to get my head around how we could talk about that in a way that wouldn't appear to be justifying the system of occupation or apartheid or settler colonialism, or whatever term you want to use to describe the system of control that's been in place for so long. But over time, in sort of learning from Suli, talking about it and talking to others and going through the process of writing, I've actually become quite convinced that talking about Jewish connection for some people can be one tool that we have in supporting liberation. It's certainly not something that I would ask Palestinians to do, but I think that for American Jews in particular, working for Palestinian freedom and collective liberation, if we allow Jewish connection to the land to only be the territory of those who would allow it to justify systems of control, then we're really leaving the people who do feel that connection, not all Jews, but many Jews, we're leaving them within the realm of the people who would justify the occupation. And this really clicked for me a while ago when I heard something that Linda Burnham wrote in 2016 after the election, after Trump was elected. She's a white anti-racist organizer. And she said, if we're not organizing white people around their suffering, we can be sure that someone else is. And I really felt that when we were starting to talk about Jewish connection, like, what does it mean for there not to be some people who care about justice working in this space and talking about it? And that's something that I'm really open to feedback around, and still is a very fraught area, but was a really interesting space of learning for me in the book with Suli. the next point I wanted to share that was an area of learning for me and continued, I hope to continue learning in this way experientially, is just that, so much of the reality on the ground in Palestine and Israel is motivated by a sense of scarcity. And right now, Israel is, controlling most everything. And that is coming from a sense that there is not enough. And actually, I think Suli models this really beautifully, and I've learned a lot from witnessing that in him, but that I believe that there is enough for everybody and that we should organize from that place and from that belief. And that Palestinian and Jewish struggles for liberation are intertwined. And not just because there have been and are Palestinian Jews, but because, our people's fates are intertwined, and there's literally no way for one people to be free when the other isn't. And thanks to Fannie Lou Hamer for articulating that in such a beautiful way in a different context. And then the final point I just wanted to make, an area of learning for me, again, I entered the book as a learner and I'm leaving it as a student as well. But I learned a lot about and hope that the book will serve as a starting point of inquiry for people interested in the power dynamics that arise when we're working with others across difference. I learned so much about this from Abraham's vision. So thank you to Erin Hontapper for the beautiful pedagogy that went into that program. But the truth is that power dynamics arise when we work with others, and particularly for those of us who are acting from identities of power. And almost everybody has an identity of power that they might be acting from in a given moment. But, for me as a white person in particular, and as a white American Jew in relationship to issues on Israel-Palestine, it was so important for me to be attentive to the dynamics of power that came up, to try and gather as much feedback and learn as much as I could from partners and from others, who've share my identities but have been in this work longer, to really be curious and learn from the dynamics that come up, and to try to repair the harm that I have done, and the mistakes that I'll continue to make, and try to adjust and continue moving forward through the work. And I think in particular, something that I've learned working with Suli is the importance of doing that with love. I think, again, so much of the root of this conflict, or this, of the occupation, apartheid, whatever, of these very real life consequences for Palestinians, so much of the roots of it lie in fear. And so as much as we can attend to those dynamics that come up with love, and, the knowledge that we'll make mistakes, and then, trying to learn from them and adjust, I think will serve us so well. And I'm, again, a student in this and excited to continue learning along those lines. So those are the things I wanted to share in terms of transformations on my end, or mini transformations maybe. But before, I think, in a few minutes, Oren is going to facilitate some Q&A, but I wanted to read a couple excerpts from the book. Just short excerpts. So the first one is from early in the book, when Suli is starting to become aware of the reality of occupation around him. And he's, as he alluded to when he spoke, starting to engage through Palestinian national music and Palestinian folkloric music, and sort of trying to keep it from his family, keep his political awakening from his family. In the family house, where the doors were always left open so the wind could move sweetly through the rooms, Sulaiman began closing his. On the second floor, he listened to cassette tapes for hours. Musica Tawriya, he learned to call it, revolutionary music. It was illegal, and this deepened the lyrics all about Hanin, a word with many others inside it, longing, but also hope, yearning, blossoming. When he listened, he closed his eyes, imagined running off in uniform to fight for his family's freedom. He pictured Samira, a girl that he had a crush on, and all the girls of the village gathered in one window. Somehow they all fit, waving to him as he left. Sulaiman played along with his wooden flute. He practiced with his breath, learned how to move it back and forth to make the shaking sound he liked. He played until his lips and fingers were sore. When he emerged one day, his mom was there applauding. Another artist in the family, she said, and clapped her hands together. You have our family's blood in you for sure, she said. Going back a long time, we've played flute and sung behind closed doors. We have warm blood, artist's blood, and a lot of us also like the taste of sweet things. He waved the back of his hand at her, didn't say anything in return. He let her think he was just becoming an artist, not considering big historical questions that would change everything, that would save them from the strange toy houses multiplying on Ras El Tawil. That's the hill where the settlement of Pisgat Zev was growing at the time. The next day, Sulaiman found the huge key to his father's storage room downstairs and went secretly, looking over his shoulder the way a boy does when he's trying to keep a secret, but just learning how. When he opened the door, he saw his grandfather's stone pillow from Tamira, a stone that his grandfather used to rest his head on, sitting among old coins, an ancient-looking radio, and a mess of papers and cups. Pulling one of his cassette tapes out of his pocket, handling it like glass, he slipped it into his Walkman and pressed play. Trying to imagine the sound of the singer Abu Arab's voice filling his body, he waited for his favorite line, the one about greeting the land of his ancestors, the one that ended, "The melodious bird is still singing for our return." Sulaiman played the tape again and again until it became scratched and worn, until the black ribbons inside came out, dancing to the music the way some people dance for rain, to make it true. And I think I'll share one other excerpt. I think we have a time for it. This is from much later in the book when Suli is organizing with Combatants for Peace. And this is a period when they were formulating the idea for these freedom marches that they were doing for some time, which were marches with Palestinians and Israelis on the Palestinian side, the West Bank side of the separation or apartheid wall. And they were having discussions about, should we have flags? Should it be a traditional protest? Should we try to do something different? So that's the context. So during these conversations where everybody was arguing, Suli argued often about the Palestinian flag. He wanted to leave it out of the march, and his friends in the movement argued back. It was funny. As a little boy, he'd drawn Palestinian flags in his notebooks, thrown all those little Palestinian flags over the electrical wires in Hizma. He'd done it before jail, before the Intifada, when the Palestinian flag was still illegal. Now that his flag was legal, he couldn't stand it, or any flag. He wanted other things, images that didn't belong, gestures that would surprise people into listening and watching. He wanted puppets and music and balloons. With all the different perspectives in the room, those planning meetings were difficult. But one of his friends said something that Suli kept repeating. We don't have to be the same. The typical demonstration with its flags was important, and so were new, strange ideas. The different strategies could help each other somehow. At one of the first freedom marches, Suli didn't see any flags. He met the others in a hot parking lot not far from Beit Jala, where nearly 10 years before he'd attended one of the first secret meetings of Combatants for Peace, not knowing what would come next. As the activists began walking, Suli thought about how it felt to wait at checkpoint 300, not far away, how it felt to walk through a cage. He looked over at Chen, his Israeli co-founder of the movement, walking next to him, holding an enormous handmade puppet. They smiled and kept walking until marchers entered a crosswalk to interrupt the fast-moving Route 60. That's a road that moves through the West Bank that I think Suli will correct me. I think anybody can use it, but a lot of Israelis are using it driving through the Palestinian West Bank. The activists stood in the middle of the road, blocking traffic, holding up enormous cardboard slabs, painted gray to match the separation wall. They stood there for a minute, holding up the cardboard wall against the noise of cars trying to get through. As someone spoke words about freedom into the loudspeaker, they let the cardboard pieces fall and let the cars continue. Suli hoped some of the drivers understood what they meant by holding cardboard and letting it fall, that they were here to show another way, another future for all of them, one in which everyone could be safe and everyone could move freely without exception. Suli looked around him and saw his friends Ahmed and Maya, Jamil and Avner, each holding a small gathering of balloons. With the slender strings in his own palms, he waited until someone shouted into the loudspeaker that it was time, cueing Suli and his friends to let go of the strings. Along with everyone around him, he tipped his head back, saw so many heads do the same, and they all laughed and yelped as their balloons floated into the sky, some over the wall into Israel, some straight up in a line toward who knows where. I'll leave it there, and Oren, I think we're ready for questions.
Thank you both so much for being here, for joining us. And also thank you for your beautiful words. Your writing is very powerful and eloquent, and both Sule and Penina, you have really remarkable stories to share, and we're really grateful that you put it on paper for all of us to read. I also want to thank you for providing a really remarkable example of, even in these dark and counter-revolutionary times, what a partnership looks like and what it looks like to build alliances across differences. I think that you both set a really incredible example of what a future of justice and peace could look like. So thank you. We have about, I'll say, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes for questions. We have a lot of questions. And the first one asks for you, Sule, as you work closely with Israelis, you must face some pushback from Palestinians who feel you're against the real struggle for ending the occupation and dealing in normalization. How do you communicate with those who feel this way?
Thanks, Oren. So the context of the what's called anti-normalization, just to say this exists in every other like similar different conflict zones. We know that in South Africa and Ireland, the word normalization, tatbiya in Arabic, has exist in their local language. You know, like reaching out to the enemy is not something mainstream in anywhere in the world. Let's put it this way. So it's not just really a Palestinian thing. I knew, like in advance, going out of the box, if you wish, of the traditional thinking of the mainstream typical Palestinian line, with both me in criticism with some people, and that's all right with me. Like I always like has not been in the mainstream anyway, socially and politically. So just to also maybe a note here important, maybe which specifically I'm not talking about myself, like generally Combatants for Peace, due to the founders of the organization that came from like a jail and struggle like background, that give you some credibility in the street, what we call it. Still, of course, like you choose a new direction, a new community, means you have to lose some people, and also to be under criticism from some even family members and friends and neighbors, and doubts, you know, with the anti-normalization, or like, yeah, I also can speak to my Israeli partners that has been attacked all the time, like specifically in Combatants for Peace and other circles that don't join and serve the system, the army, the occupation, they go to jail even. So let's say there is a price to be paid on one side. On the other side, like having a new community and solidarity and a new network that provide you with support and optimism, actually. Sorry, I just had Corona a few weeks ago, so it's not out yet. I saw it also in the question Suzanne asked. I believe there is different strategies to reach our freedom. There is no one way. So that's why I still believe, actually, from my experience in real life, with all the criticism and the legitimate controversial questions here, specifically for Palestinians living under the occupation, obviously, if you are the weak part of the conflict, of course, your needs are not to reconcile with the occupiers. Like, of course, it's not in our national agenda is to make reconciliation before ending the occupation. So there is really legitimate criticism, I have to say, when it comes from Palestinians. Generally, I'm really fine with that. You know, like I have family live in Jordan, or like Palestinian living in a refugee camp in Lebanon or in the US, and they can't visit their homeland like my family can't. So of course, I feel open to have conversations and criticism in one side. And the other side, the strategies that we are using to face and struggle against the system, as I said, from the experience here and from other places, I really believe nonviolence is the only way for us Palestinians to achieve our freedom, and also that would enable Israelis, some Israelis, let's be correct, to join the struggle. And that's similar to South Africa. We know a lot of white folks like joined the struggle in South Africa. And that's, we know also even in the US lately during Trump time and before in the 60s, and now with Black Lives Matter also, we can see a lot of similarities here. So I think that Israelis that want really to challenge the system and the separation system has to be welcome in our spaces, while we should be aware of the power dynamic and to allow the Palestinian voices to be in the lead and in charge of our life. And that's really important. And in this note, I want to say, I know a lot of activists from all sides that started somewhere in a dialogue program, which we know, like Penina spoke about some, and we can spoke about, I don't want to name organizations because like there is a bunch of organizations that are doing like meetings and dialogue programs, and there are some organizations doing direct action, which is needed. There are some organizations like Competence for Peace and a few others doing both, I would say, reconciliation and also direct action to oppose the occupation and calling for refusing the army, which is something important in our case here. And I think all these strategies has not, I don't see a conflict there. I saw that these strategies would help our long journey and seeking for freedom and liberation, which is gonna be long, as the late African-American leader, I forget his name.
John Lewis.
John Lewis, that died like a few months ago, is speaking about the same, that this struggle is not for 1 week strategy, for 1 year, it's a long life strategy, because we don't know when the real change is happening, and we do step by step. With that said, we expect challenges, criticism, threats sometimes, and of course, like as I said, like sometimes, if I want to be honest, I'm more like frustrated if a Western person coming here for like a short period of time with good intention criticizing me, I have a problem with that. But if it's a Palestinian person that's specifically the one living really under the occupation conditions, I totally understand, because I live in the same conditions and my family too. So I really understand the frustration and the anger and the hopelessness. Though I believe the majority of our people just want to live normally if they're given the opportunity, but we are not there. People are struggling here in the Palestinian side to get permits, like for survival needs, for like vaccination now, for like food, for daily life. So we're not in a place where the majority would support reconciliation process.
Thank you very much, Suli. Penina, can you elaborate on developing a sense of Jewish connectedness with the land, and how we can feel that without contributing to a traditional Zionist narrative that the land is ours and not theirs?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's a question I'm asking myself as well. So I'll speak to what I'm feeling now, and I think this is a conversation I am going to need to keep having with people. You know, the system, you know, Zionism as it has played out, and there's a good argument for saying that this is how it was conceived as well. You could have a discussion about that, but you know, it's using Western colonial systems of control, right? Checkpoints, separation, based on race or ethnic group. And historically, we've had this connection to this land in our texts for a very long time, much longer than any history of Western colonialism. So I think that's up for us to explore. I mean, I think that, maybe the easiest answer would be to say, certainly some of us might express it or feel it symbolically, but for some people, it is going to be a connection to the actual land. And I think that there's probably going to be a lot to learn from Palestinian indigenous experiences and other indigenous cultures and Jews who are indigenous in different places in terms of relearning a way to be with the land without thinking that it belongs to us. And I think there are traditions of that in Judaism as well. I'm not a scholar of Judaism, but the practice of, I'm going to forget it now. Maybe Oren will tell me, but the practice of returning land, letting land lay fallow every 7 years, and then actually I think every 49 years or 50 years, actually redistributing the land so that everybody starts again. So we have lots of things to think about in our texts and in relation to our histories, and I think a lot of ways that connection could be expressed that is not has nothing to do with the oppression of Palestinians. And actually, in order for us to really express it, Palestinians have to be free. So I hope that is the opening of an answer. I think it's definitely a conversation that would have to be continued over years.
And hopefully these conversations will continue beyond this this short webinar. We have time for really one more question. So I'm going to pose a series of questions combining a bunch of things that have come in. The first is sort of what do you disagree on? You mentioned that you disagree on things. What do you two disagree on? And you were also talking about liberation without going into what that would look like. The question is, what would Palestinian liberation look like to you? What do Israelis need liberation from if they are the ones upholding the occupation? And lastly, could you explain a bit more about how these two liberation movements are intertwined?
How many minutes do we have?
Take the time you need to answer these complicated questions.
Billy, do you want to try for one of them first? Okay. Oh my gosh, there are so many. I'll start with what we disagree on. I think that generally, so I mean, Suli, in relation to the question of normalization, Suli was talking about combatants for peace, which I certainly don't feel is normalizing. I think, especially because of the direct action component, I don't really understand the argument that Israelis and Palestinians going to be with Palestinian shepherds to make sure that they're not harassed by settlers. I personally can't see that as normalization. I think I do have a little bit more suspicion of dialogue when it's just dialogue than Suli does. I also think through this process have softened towards that a little bit. I do think it is the entry point for many people. And I think also it can be harmful if it's done the wrong way. And I think that's an area where we have had some, not huge disagreement, but again, sort of a question of emphasis on what sort of how much suspicion we have or how much we want to lean into that suspicion. So that's one example of an area we disagree. And maybe I'll speak to what do Israelis need liberation from? I mean, they need liberation from being oppressors. Doing violence to other people is traumatic. And of course we need to be careful not to compare. The people who are suffering the results of the occupation are having a very different experience, and we need to hold that. But we are Israelis are being traumatized every day by being occupiers, and we in order to live full Jewish lives, for those of us who orient towards that, or to just be loving humans, we need to not be oppressing other people. And I think and I think also Israelis have legitimate needs for safety and security that for various reasons have been triggered over the course of this conflict or situation of occupation, and they deserve to feel safe, and many of them don't feel safe. And again, not an excuse on any level for occupying another people in their land, but I think liberation will include both being liberated from being the occupiers and also being able to feel safe and benefit from a society in which everyone is free. I think, there are going to be so many benefits to that we can't even quite imagine yet. I think there's a lot of organizing in the US led by Black organizers, reimagining like what do communities look like without policing, that could teach us some things about how do we imagine what that will look like. But it's going to take some radical imagining, but I can sort of feel it, like it will change everything for everybody in beautiful ways, I think. I'll pause there.
Sulaiman, you want to add anything?
Oh, I think he keeps getting muted. Hold on, I think. Let's see. Suli, can you unmute yourself now?
Now, yeah, now it's good. Thanks. Yeah, I see about a few questions. So because of the time, I guess, let me say like generally, as Mina mentioned, I'm not going into the area of comparing like who's suffering more. Obviously, there is like power dynamic here, and there are people living under the occupation. At the same time, I see the only way for us, both sides here, that are not leaving, like being here to leave. So both sides are going to be here to stay. So of course, we have to find a way in order to create a system that really based on sharing values and resources. And I think some of joint organizations can represent this idea. For example, if we talk about Combatants for Peace, for example, we had like in every decision making, there are people from both sides, despite the historical like imbalance in power, obviously. But that really helped create a common knowledge, common language, and common feeling of responsibility, for example. While in the reality on the ground, there is no sharing resources, like from the land to the water to everything. The Israel is in charge of everything as a reality here. So we try to provide like a hopeful model that can work. I actually watched the J Street conference 2 days ago, and I really feel like practical solutions are there if we agree in some values and some principles that people are equal by nature. And they spoke like a few people, Sam and Dalia were speaking about a model of confederation, for example, that give each community the right for self-determination and freedom and state, and a model of cooperation for both sides. So I think there are enough models really that can work, that work in other countries like before, and still working in many other countries that were in conflict also. So I think we have to provide like a model that inspire people, that got people to be excited about it, rather than a model of separation. You are here and we are there. So I personally support a model that bring our peoples together and engaging with each other than separation. Until we are there, like the destination, I believe the journey and the way is so important. Of course, not everything has to work jointly. Of course, there is work to be happened, and in each side, like to the question of what Israeli have to be free from being occupiers. I don't think this is like something I want to be in the shoes of the occupiers either. I think liberation has to include both the people under the occupation in the first place as a priority, and the occupier power also, in order to create a more just system that really respect the human rights of the people and the land here.
Thank you both very much, and thank you to everyone for coming to this important conversation. the book answers a lot of the questions that you have that were not answered today. So I highly encourage you to get and to read the book. Penina and Sulaiman are on social media, I should say, so you can find them there if you have more questions that are unanswered. Also, I want to say that this webinar will, for those of you who did not catch the whole thing and want to be able to see everything, the SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice has a YouTube channel. In the next week or so, we will have this uploaded to the channel, so you can search for it there. And once again, a tremendous thank you to our partners, to Extend, to the Middle East Studies program at USF, and to the USF Institute for Nonviolence and Social Justice. Thank you very much. And Penina and Suli, I really can't thank you enough for coming, for writing this book, and for putting forth really positive examples and ways to think about a future rooted in justice and equality for everyone. So thank you for your hard work and your dedication to this. And with that, goodbye, and thank you to you all.
Thank you so much for having us.
Shukran.
Wonderful.